So welcome here today, Stephanie Schuttler. Is it Schuttler? Is that how you say it?
Yes, Schuttler.
Got it right first time. Got it. Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about wildlife biology because it sounds interesting. I'm fascinated by what you do. So, I mean, where did the motivation to do this come from?
For me, it was all about my love of animals, which I mean sounds kind of obvious given it's wildlife,
Right.
but I didn't know you could become a wildlife biologist until later on in life. And in college, I found out about it. And actually, when I thought about scientists, I thought about Jane Goodall. She was really the only scientist I
Yeah.
know. I know a lot of people think of like scientists in lab coats and stuff like that, but I thought of Jane Goodall, who went to Tanzania to study chimpanzees. And I love nature and I loved animals, but I was not as outdoorsy as that. My family
Hmm.
wasn't. We would take this annual trip to Allegheny State Park, and our version of camping was staying at hotels. But we would be like in the like close to the park, so it felt very rural and everything.
Hmm.
So when I thought about wildlife biology, or actually I didn't even know it was a career option. I thought you just had to be like Jane Goodall and go out there and do it. And I was like, that doesn't seem like a real job.
Yeah.
So I discovered it when my brother suggested I study abroad. And at the time, I was actually studying theater, and biology was a backup career, so that I could become a physician if it all failed, because that was a financially stable job.
Yeah.
And I was just really attracted to this one brochure program in Kenya, and I went for it. It was all about wildlife management, and yeah, I just decided, or I learned that you could do all these different positions in the United States and elsewhere, and you could still do research in Africa. You didn't have to live there. So that's when I decided to do it, and I already loved animals. Um, but yeah, I'd say for me it was like my love of animals. But I would say people are really driven by two things. They're usually driven by like a species or a group of species, or they're driven by scientific questions. Like they have to figure out answers to things. And then probably a third reason is conservation as well. I was just deeply affected by conservation as a child. I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and like in the 90s there was a big environmental movement, so that hit me hard. So I'm not as like, I am a scientist, I'm definitely a scientist, but I'm not as driven as much by the science side as I am about like the applied side to help wildlife.
Yeah. I find that fascinating. And I'm going to get to the fancy scientists. We're going to get to the, I love that name, by the way. I think it's
Oh,
great.
good.
Um, what is something you think would be surprising for people to know about what you do in your work?
Well, the surprising answer is probably really boring, but I think most people, when they think about wildlife biologists, they think you're like constantly in the field and
Yeah,
you're constantly like touching animals, or like, I don't know, bottle feeding animals and stuff like
it's
that.
like a commercial or something.
So that's more like rehabilitation work, or zookeeping. And even modern zoos, they want to have a distance between them and the animals. It's becoming less and less um, hands off and more no contact, because they
Mm,
want to keep the animals more natural and more
yeah.
wild, at least the good zoos. So if you probably seen Tiger King, so
Oh
like
my
Joe
gosh.
Exotic Joe Exotic Zoo is not a good zoo. Anytime where you can handle cubs, it's not a good zoo, and we could talk
No.
about that too.
Yeah.
But so yeah, so a big part of my job is actually, especially post PhD, is writing papers, reading other scientific papers, and analyzing data. So a lot of indoor work. And as technology improves, we don't have to go to the field as much. So we have like sensors, like I worked with camera traps. So you put them on the tree and they take pictures of animals as they walk by. And before, so that was only a couple of decades ago where we didn't have camera traps. Scientists would have to go to the forest or wherever. And if they couldn't see the animals, like there's so many animals that are difficult to see.
Hmm.
Um, not all the animals are out in the open, like deer or squirrels. You had to like study them, um, like through other signs, like indirect signs like scat or markings or things like that. So yeah, a lot of my work is actually indoors. I don't handle animals ever for my job, and usually when wildlife biologists do, it's like I said, it's a small part, unless maybe if you're, I guess birders can do it a lot sometimes, and amphibians and reptiles, but even if you're doing something like where you attach a tracker to a mammal, you're just not doing it that much because you're tracking so few mammals. The trackers are expensive, and it's expensive to actually attach it because you have to have vets with you and anesthetize them. Well, it depends on the animal.
Right.
Um, but and then the trackers last a really long time too. So you just and they're satellite now, so you can just sit in your office and get the locations of the animal nice in your office. Whereas before, like I said, you had to go to the field with these big antenna. So yeah, I spend a lot of time indoors. That's probably like that's the most surprising but not fun
Yeah.
answer.
Well, it's like one of those fields, I think, where like you're swept up by what you saw in a movie or something.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, I bet Stephanie's out there in the rainforest, she's touching gorillas or something. It's just like looking, like take a closer look. It's like a thing. Yeah.
I did get to do cool field things. Like for my PhD, I
Mhm.
studied forest elephants. So I definitely those are animals that you can see in certain places.
Yeah.
They're difficult to see in most of the range. But yeah, I did study them and watched them. But the last like 7 years, all of my I did do some field work, but not very much.
Mhm.
Most I worked with camera traps, and most were actually set up by volunteers. So I was looking at animals, but the pictures of them, and
Right.
I think that's really fun because you just get to see them in a way that
Yeah.
their guards down. They're just doing what they do.
They're just what do man, there's a lot of things I want to get to, but it made me think of like what do you think people's relationship with animals is currently, like our current societal relationship with
Oh
animals in
wow,
the wild?
that's a great question. Um, I think it totally depends on the type of animal it is and species. So
Mhm.
I think, animals like snakes, people have a fear of them. Or there's certain animals we don't like we find disgusting, like cockroaches,
Yeah.
or I just think about like all the animals we want to exterminate around our house. I think I think the biggest problem that we have right now, or relationship right now, is very disconnected. And one of the reasons in my career, I recently switched more to doing science communication through my website and YouTube channel, because I want to reestablish that connection, and that's really what's important for people to have conservation attitudes and behaviors. That's what research shows. So kids, especially going out into nature and seeing animals, then they become emotionally connected to them and other
Mm.
animals, and then they start to care. So right now, and I'm guilty of this too, we're spending a lot of time indoors, and it's kind of like the animals are over there, and especially if you go to a zoo, like you really see that, oh, the animals are over there and
Yeah.
there's no animals around me. But in reality, I mean, they're everywhere. And I mean, wildlife, in terms of wildlife biology, usually refers to land animals and non-insect animals. um, but the term wildlife in general really means any animal, and some people even consider plants and fungi wildlife. So yeah, I guess we think it's over there, but it actually is mixed in with all of us. and there's some species that are coming closer to us that have, like coyotes live in downtown Chicago, and that's a pretty new
Whoa,
phenomenon
I didn't know that.
within the past several decades. In Mumbai, leopards live in the city of Mumbai, so some animals have made a comeback, and yeah, there's birds always all around us. In New York City, I'm sure you have um, squirrels and pigeons. It might not be like
Yeah.
the most
Yeah.
exciting animal, but you have animals all around you no matter where you live.
It's funny is I live in Blaine, Washington's right on the border of Canada. And I guess it's like
Mhm.
a very famous migratory pattern place for birds. Like we have the craziest birds here. We have like I see eagles every day. It's constant. It's so
Yeah.
it's like normal here. Blue herons, all that stuff. And
Mhm.
um and then we've tried to teach my daughter about that, like we're seeing, the majesty of a bird. And it's much funny you mentioned like some people think about plants as being wildlife. I never thought of that. Like, where does
I
that
think
come from?
it's a newer thing. I because people are just so speciest, even scientists. So I just mean like they have a preference for certain species.
Yeah.
So like when you think of conservation, you think of elephants, tigers, and there's mixed research to show that like if you fundraise for a tiger, will it benefit all the other animals in the
Mm.
habitat?
Hmm.
Um, but or sorry, if you do management for a tiger, if you
Okay.
fundraise, you can absolutely use that money to pay for other animals. But I think like they just want to change the narrative that all beings play an important role. And the whole circle of life thing with the Lion King, you
Sure.
you
Yeah. Yeah. Okay,
you
come on.
kick out one
Yeah, Simba.
and you miss one species, or one species declines, that can impact, in some cases it can impact a whole ecosystem. So I think just kind of like how we're talking with people and inclusivity, like including all the species.
Yeah. Isn't that kind of like with like whales and fish and all that? Like how, if we through oh gosh, I'm messing this up. I'm like anybody, right? I watched a documentary on it about I'm like it was
Well, some
like
of them are
about
very good.
yeah, and it was about like, we overfish the seas and then that affects whales and their eating patterns and things. It feels like
Yeah,
we're starting to like understand this more. Like, hey, this thing triggers the next thing. It's like dominoes. Do you
exactly.
sense in your profession that more people like a general awakening of more of this from the general public?
It's so hard to tell because most of my experience when I talk about my research is like giving a talk I worked at a museum. So our museum was free. So it actually was probably more representative of the general public than other museums, because you might be selecting for people who are already interested in nature and wildlife. They're willing to pay the admission. Um, I don't know. It's really hard to say. I think people really have a fascination with animals and nature, but I don't know if our knowledge has increased a lot.
Hmm.
And I mean, there's definitely issues that people are confused about, and the science is really clear on. So and this is another reason why I switched more to science communication, is because I found that like you could research things to death, but if people aren't changing anything, then there's really no point to the research, especially with conservation.
Hmm.
So like I think of climate change, obviously, where climate change has been, or vaccines, they've been really well
Mm-hmm.
studied. And if the public doesn't believe in it, or if they don't want to listen to the data or understand how the data was collected, and therefore don't trust it, then it's really a communication issue and not a science issue.
That's fascinating. Can you expand on that because I think that's a very hot topic today on some level. It's like okay, well, like you just said, well, the research is very clear on
Hmm.
something, well, yet the people are not changing their habits. Maybe some specific examples in your field of that you can talk about.
Well, in my field, I mean, probably climate change is the biggest one, or
Hmm.
tangential to my field. I don't directly work in climate, but climate affects all species on
Of
the planet.
course.
Um, but I think scientists learn from data, so they think that everyone learns from data. And there has not been a lot of investment in science communication or science. I mean, I guess we're taught science in school, but we're really not taught. We're taught how the scientific method works, but we're not
Mhm.
taught like it in practice. Like I didn't really understand growing up that there was still like stuff to be discovered, to tell you the truth. Like because when you're in science class, like, everyone, you just study and you look for the answer,
That's
and the
right.
teacher always has the answer. So I have a program that I just started for kids, and like a big thing that I'm trying to teach them is like to keep asking questions, because that's really what science is all about. So yeah, so people, I can't remember where I was going with this,
It's
but
okay.
people, yeah, it's a communication issue, and scientists, I think, have historically always been like more data, more data, more data, and more graphs, and people don't change because it conflicts with something they already believe. Okay, a good example of my field is like the wolves out west.
Okay.
So like there is people who live amongst the wolves. A lot of them don't like the wolves. They want to shoot them, or they have shot them illegally or
Hmm.
legally. And and in many of these cases, or in Yellowstone in particular, the wolves were reintroduced. So they hadn't been
Yes.
there for a while, and then people had to get used to them. And of course, they don't stay in the park; they go outside the park,
Hmm.
and they do kill livestock once in a while, but not much. And like the research shows that killing them does not help, but people just still want to kill them. Or here coyotes is another big one. We have studies that show that killing coyotes, it definitely doesn't help, and it might even make the problem worse. That's what the trends seem to be saying. And again, people just, I don't know exactly why they don't like coyotes. I
I
guess,
don't
I mean,
get
they
it.
do kill, they do kill dogs,
Uh-huh.
small dogs, so I understand that. But and I guess they kill outdoor cats too. And
Yeah.
some people like that because they hate outdoor cats because the cats kill birds.
All right.
um and then there's a bunch of cat lovers. But yeah, like even if I were to talk about the data and the trends, they like, I've talked to people on like Instagram or my social media about this, and they just like will argue with me. And so really, science communication is about trying to take your message and put it in a lens that the people can understand or relate to.
Yeah.
So with climate change, I think that scientists should try to embed it more in people's religion, and not necessarily like putting it in the religion, but using passages from, I mean, I'm most familiar with Christianity, but like
Right.
using
Mhm.
passages from the Bible
Sure.
where it talks about loving the earth and caring for the earth, and use that to help spread a message, rather than this narrow scientific message that doesn't resonate with people.
I love that. That I had never thought about actually before. Well, because I think, do you think there's like, for scientists in general, you're living in this world of deeply embedded scientific knowledge. And
Hmm.
sometimes there's this issue of not being relatable to most people. Like there's a
Exactly.
severe lack of digital literacy and scientific literacy. I mean, like, you have your doctorate, right? I believe so.
Hmm.
I have a doctorate. Now we could look at a research study and I can understand the methodology, the N number,
Hmm.
statistical analysis. But I mean, you realize most people don't know that, right? Like they don't
No,
like, and they
absolutely.
don't really care either. Like they're like, anyways, what's the results of this study? And is it interesting? Is it like,
Yeah,
it's
and it's
strange.
yeah, and I was on another podcast where they were talking about like how can someone look at a study and know if it's like solid or not. And
Yeah.
I mean, that's hard even for me. Like if I were to like, if there was a study saying that like blueberries reduce your risk of cancer, and I were to
Yeah.
look at that study, I I could read the methods and understand them, but I'm not necessarily familiar if that's like the best
Yeah.
method in that field. Like you really have to be on top of your research and know like what good sample sizes are for that
Mhm.
field. Um, but but yeah, it's complicated. What's your, and then also journals too? Like, you know, there's better
Mhm.
journals and worse journals. What's your doctorate in?
It's in sports education leadership with an
Oh,
emphasis in
cool.
behavior modification. This is long-winded. Behavior modification and sports and exercise settings. Uh, so
Cool.
it's really just human behavior, understanding how people behave, but in particularly why people exercise, why they don't exercise, and defining what exercise is and isn't, and then really getting to the origin biologically of why people feel like they don't want to exercise. So I've been on a lot of podcasts talking about that and the kind of the
Hmm.
anthropological and biological kind of history of why humans just don't like to exercise. And so it's been very
'Cause it's
interesting
not fun.
conversation. It's not fun, and it's biologically is not something we really.
Yeah.
Speaking of conservation, kind of funny. Like when you said conservation, I'm like, man, I think of conservation so differently. Like when that word, because I think of like exercise conservation and the history of humans, we've conserved our calories for hunter
Mhm.
and gathering, tubing, reproduction. And so what we currently do is so foreign to us. Somebody runs in a treadmill, exercising for the purpose of health, like structured, is foreign to our biology. So it
Mhm.
makes sense you shouldn't like it because it's not natural. Biologically, it's the opposite of what we've been doing forever, type of thing.
Yeah.
And I think of that word conservation. I kind of curious about that word. I've heard it so much, but what does that actually mean and what you're doing? Because I don't know if people know, honestly, really.
On it, oh geez, that's you ask really good questions.
Thanks.
I would say it is a debatable term, and I think
Mm,
it's changed with time. But I think historically with conservation, people had more of like a preservation type of attitude. So
mhm.
like like the United States is big on national parks. And I think they were the
Yeah,
first to make national parks, but like create a national park, separate humans from it. So yes, we can visit national parks, but nobody lives in them.
yeah.
And you know, even taking people out of national parks, which has you know, huge implications for indigenous communities.
Mhm.
And I mean, this still happens today. There's national parks that were declared not so long ago. Um, but I think, yeah, more of that like hands off, like keep everything natural. But I think now, well, we can't just have animals in protected areas. They need different animals need different requirements. So some are just not big enough for animals, and like you mentioned, migratory birds, they're gonna
Mhm.
need, you know, parks down a whole coast and two across two
Yeah,
continents.
yeah. Wow. Yeah.
And you can't always do that. So I think the more term the term now I think more has to do with um like I guess it's still preserving as many species and as much biodiversity as possible, but I do think there is more of a human integration
Hmm.
and less of a need to separate the two. So like so
Interesting.
more research in where humans live and in more urban settings, and
Yeah.
that and understanding that animals live outside of parks.
Right. I mean, you had mentioned about animals are living. I mean, like in Chicago, there's animals and
Hmm.
things like that. Like, do you think that this is a product of a lot of deforestation and things of that nature? I'm trying to understand this myself. Like, we're living closer and closer to animals. What are the implications of that?
Totally depends on the species, but I mean, so development in general is bad. It will kill
Hmm.
species no matter what. But that being said, you can develop in a way to minimize that. So, like Vancouver does a really great job at
Hmm.
being a green city. They
Definitely.
incorporate a lot of parks that are more natural. I think their goal is to become like the greenest city in the world.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. And what was your question again? I'm sorry. Let's make sure you thought after that.
No, like what's
What
the
were we talking
impact?
about?
What was the
Oh yeah,
impact?
yeah. What's the
Yeah.
impact? Um, that being said, though, some animals have made a comeback, or some animals even thrive with human
Oh,
development.
really? Oh.
Because I mean, if you think about like raccoons, pigeons, I mean, all
Oh
those
my.
animals thrive with it. So they can adapt. And there's also like different habitats created with human development, like edges and just different structures. So some animals do well. Um, but in general, yeah, development is definitely correlated with loss of biodiversity.
Interesting. I'm learning a lot here. I got to tell you, this is pretty crazy stuff.
Yeah, we actually did a study on the mammals in Raleigh and DC, and we found that the diversity and the abundance was not significantly different from the wild spaces around the
hmm,
city. But this was for mammals and larger mammals, so mammals that could be captured on a camera trap.
yeah.
So no bats or no small mammals. Um, and the other thing about our area is a lot of the sensitive species have already gone extinct. So
Oh,
so wolves no longer live here in the eastern United States, and cougars no longer live here, even though people will tell me that's not true,
yeah.
but they no longer live here in the United States. So those species would have likely have been most affected by development anyway. But yeah, most species were not effective. It was really only bobcats that were affected a little bit.
Yeah.
And I think coyotes a little bit, but not that much. But yeah, in general, coyotes are really, really good at adapting. And that's
Right.
why they've been able to move into Chicago and LA and New York City.
Wow. Is there, I don't know, this may be a strange question, but like, is there one species of animal that is like critically important to the planet's health?
I don't know if there's one species, maybe us, because we can control the outcome on
Okay.
everything by
Yeah,
changing
that's
our
probably true,
behavior.
but
Um, but I mean, yeah, there's very important species for each or in different ecosystems.
right. Or ones that are maybe heavier weighted. Like, I don't know. Like, I always wonder that. It's like, well, if this species went away or is extinct, it would like drastically change the ecosystem of a certain environment. Yeah.
Yeah, so forest elephants and elephants are in general are like that.
Really?
Mhm. So they can change the structure of so savanna elephants can change like a more forest area and make it almost like a desert because they knock down trees. So yeah. So in places like South Africa where they have a lot of elephants, that can actually be bad for some other animals. But forest elephants, they are being poached right now really badly. And they are important because they're seed dispersers. So they eat fruits and then they poop them out, and of course they
Mhm.
travel. And when they poop them, they're moved, hundreds of meters away, so that the seed can then or the trees can then repopulate in different areas. And some species of plants are even exclusively dependent on forest elephants to
Mm.
germinate. So they need to be eaten by a forest elephant. So if forest elephants go extinct, yeah, you will definitely lose some species. The forest will look different because certain species won't travel as far. It will likely reduce biodiversity. And forests are really important for the planet because they absorb carbon.
Right.
So there could be some pretty gigantic impacts, no pun intended, for
Yeah,
for the
exactly.
forest elephants.
Did you see? Like, I just saw this. I swear I wasn't looking this up for this interview. It just came to me, damn algorithms. It was like the California condor is going to be reintroduced to the Pacific Northwest at some point. I just
I
literally
haven't
just saw that.
I haven't heard that. That's great.
I don't even know why. Like I see that I go, that sounds good, but I have no understanding of why that's important. Like,
Well, I mean, condors and vultures in general are really important for scavenging.
okay.
But I think I think in the case of the condor, it's not necessarily that their loss has a gigantic impact on the ecosystem, because I would expect that. Now, I'm not an expert, but I could expect that like vultures, like turkey vultures and stuff could take their place. So in
Hmm.
that case, I think it's more of like the idea of saving a species, that
Hmm.
condors, are these amazing species with large wingspans, and we should save them because we are able to. And they're actually they're a pretty good conservation success story, because they were impacted by DDT, which
Oh,
weakened their eggshells,
wow.
and um, and yeah, there are just so few of them, so they had to have reintroduction programs done with the zoos, and it looks like they're expanding their range, so that's good.
Yeah, I was like, okay, this sounds like a good thing, but I don't have the knowledge of like when I think about like that Yellowstone, like I go to Yellowstone a lot. I love that place so much. And I remember when they were talking about reintroducing wolves.
Mhm.
And still I'm like, why? Like what's like like take me behind that. What's the mechanism behind reintroducing a species like that into the environment?
So again, there's different motivations. I think some people were like, wolves used to be here. We should bring them back
Okay.
because it's like the right thing to do. And in the case of wolves, and usually predators in general, especially apex predators,
Yeah.
they can actually influence the ecosystem. So
Mm.
Yellowstone is actually like a classic example of what we call a trophic cascade, where
What a
where like
word,
like
trophic cascade. I mean, what a phrase. What the heck?
we're like, well, it's like one animal will have a big impact on other ones.
Oh, okay.
So with wolves, even the presence of a wolf will change the behavior of elk in the park, their main
Oh.
prey. So even if a wolf never eats an elk, or preys upon an elk, the elk will act differently. They won't be so bold. They won't go
Mm.
into like the fields and just eat calmly. They know wolves are around, and so this allows different plants to come back, and then that has different implications on other wildlife like the beavers, and they could create dams. So there's this video called I actually didn't know about until recently, which is terrible, but somebody was like, I read something about coyotes changing rivers, and I was like, what?
What? Wait a minute.
But the video is called wolves change rivers, because the cascading effects all eventually, like the beavers changing the dams, they actually affects the course of the river. So it's
Whoa.
it's it's about it's basically about like what would have a big impact in bringing things back the way they used to be.
I see.
The complicated part with conservation is like, how far do you go back? That's
Yeah.
a good question, and something that people debate, because things are changing all the time. Like if you actually think, some people argue that people were part of the cause, at least, for killing mammoths and
Yeah.
mastodons. So so some scientists actually have the idea, like, should we bring elephants over into North America? And they are not the exact same thing as mammoths or mastodons, but their foraging behavior, and like just the fact that they're big and trampling and stuff, it actually affects all the soil and the plant. Or bison are another big one.
Yeah.
They've the Midwest and West has changed a lot because of the loss of bison. So I think usually people think about like big players in terms of ecosystem impact. They have to think about the public too, like what is the public willing to support, like
Yeah.
wolves. In Colorado, it just passed, but I think by the thinnest of margins, it was like, 50-49 in favor of wolves. So that's another big thing, is no matter, because these programs are expensive. They have to
Hmm.
either transport the animals, or they have to captive rear them and reintroduce them. Oftentimes there's a lot of like genetic work, and
Mm.
housing and everything. So it's an expensive thing, which of course taxpayers pay for. You need public support for. And then if you're going to spend all this money to get a wolf to survive and released into Colorado, but the residents don't want it and they shoot it, like, it's like It's like a big
Right.
waste of money as
What
well
the
as
heck, man?
effort and energy. So, so scientists, yeah, they have to think about all these different factors, and it's not
It's
just easy as like putting
it's
a wolf out
dizzying.
there.
I mean, actually, even just thinking about elephants being in North America, I had like this thought in my mind, like this elephants just all over the place and just walking around. I'm like, people would go nuts.
Exactly. Yeah. There actually is a sanctuary in Tennessee for elephants that's
Oh,
pretty big, and the elephants are all free roaming. So that would be a cool place to look at
oh man.
habitat.
That'd be pretty cool. So what's your before I get to the fancy scientists, because I definitely want to check it out. What's the kind of history of zoos and the relationship we have with zoos? Like you mentioned this kind of newer progressive idea about zoos. I don't think a lot of people are hip to this idea. Like
Yeah.
they don't know.
So historically, zoos were just meant for entertainment. Like, if you
Oh.
think like really like centuries ago, explorers would go to different places or millennia ago, and they would, take these animals because they looked cool and put them in cages so people could see them. Now, as we learn more about animals and conservation, zoos have changed to still educate or entertain the public, but educate them as well. I mean, people do go to the zoo for fun. If you have
Hmm.
kids, you're like, let's go to the zoo. You're not necessarily saying, like, let's go to educate them. It's more like a fun thing to do.
Yeah.
But zoos now know that, or a lot of people, this is the only way they see a lot of these animals,
Yeah.
myself included. Like, there's many animals I've never seen in the wild that I've seen in zoos. And they can serve as an educational platform. And if those kids can have those emotional connections with animals at a young
Hmm.
age, it can have a big impact. They can also spread conservation messages that can change people's behavior. It's hard to do, but they can do that. Um, but they also are important for conservation. And like I said, it depends on the zoo. So zoo is a very loose term, and there's like really amazing zoos, and then there's zoos that should be shut down in a heartbeat,
Yeah.
or the animals would honestly all be better euthanized. Like, they're so awful.
Wow.
So like the better zoos are usually those accredited by the Association for Zoological and Aquariums, or for zoos and aquariums in the United States, AZA. But they'll have, bigger habitats, more realistic or enclosures. They will have enrichment, which is like activities for the animals to do, or just different like stimuli that will encourage them to do more natural behavior. And then the roles that zoos play for conservation is, like when you're talking about the condor program, they had to captive raise all those chicks, and you do that through a zoo. So there's a lot of species that people don't know about that are endangered and are little, and some of them might not even be like shown to the public. Like, they might be
Hmm.
like little frogs or insects, and zoos are really important for breeding those, and then reintroducing them to the wild. There is also populations or species out there that are very vulnerable to extinction. So, like in Colombia, there's a species of monkey. They're only found there. They're critically endangered. And I don't know, like, say like a major catastrophe happened in Colombia, then that species would go extinct. Zoos could be a reservoir of that species, and across zoos, you have enough genetic material that you could breed the species and then reintroduce them into the wild. But
Oh.
those are the main purposes of zoos. But really, anytime you're going to a zoo and it's like just cages, or
Yeah.
you can touch the animals, that's a big red flag too.
Yikes.
The only time you should really be able to touch the animals if there's a zookeeper with the animal, and usually tends to be animals more like snakes or turtles, or
Yeah.
even domestic animals. But yeah, like the Tiger King thing where you get to pet the cubs and stuff, that is a
It's
big red
crazy.
flag that it's bad for the animals.
I mean, what a mess. That whole thing is like just crazy. It was one of the more
Yeah.
outrageous things I've ever seen. I was like, this guy's nuts. It's like just in there with them and it's like, oh, okay, these tigers, no
Yeah.
big deal. So you say zoos are like progressing more towards where they need to be at this point? Oh,
Yeah, and it's still, I mean, it's still a debatable subject because like animals like elephants and chimpanzees, they're so intelligent, they're
Yeah.
very social. Some people think that they don't belong in zoos at all. And some zoos recognize that they don't have the facilities to keep animals like elephants, and they have released their elephants to sanctuaries. But others, they think like, the elephants are a big draw and they
Hmm.
keep them. Um, but yeah, as we learn more about animals, we learn, that they're not happy in these captive
Oh,
environments, or some of them aren't. Some do fine in captive environments.
right.
Um, but again, it's a balance between like, okay, if people never see an elephant, will they care about elephants? Or,
Right.
do we need to have some in captivity? And the better thing about zoos now too is that it's pretty much all captive breeding, especially for mammals, birds. They really don't take animals from the wild anymore unless it's like the numbers are so low that
Yeah.
they are saving them to try to breed them to reintroduce them. Like they had to do that for the black-footed ferret, but most zoos, yeah, they captive breed the animals. So yeah, there's no chance these animals can go back to the wild anyway.
Oh, I see. Wow. Incredible. Literally, like,
Yeah.
it's crazy stuff.
And
Like, how do you
it's a
know
tough
unless you
issue.
ask? You don't know unless you ask. That's like my whole podcast. I just get people on. I'm like, I don't know anything about this. I'm gonna learn what's going on. Like, and then you can
That's what
filled
I do
with
on my podcast too. Even if
right.
I think I know something, I just start talking to them.
You just get filled with knowledge, right? And then it's like from people who are passionate. They love this stuff, and it's like their life's professional work. And it's like I could sense that joy in you, and just like you just boom, answer comes out. It's automatic. It's like
Thank you.
yeah. So how has this culminated in the fancy scientists? I checked it out a little bit, but I'd love to hear from your point of view.
So that's just my social media handle, and I named my website after that. And I guess my business now that I've changed to being an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
But when I first started wildlife biology, I felt like I didn't fit in especially in graduate school, because like none of the women wore makeup and nobody would really dress up. Like they would wear like field clothes like to the office. And I'm a little dressed down today because when I
Yeah.
feel weird dressing up at home. But I like dressing up. I like makeup. I like stereotypically girly things.
Yeah.
My father owned a jewelry store, so I was always like looking at the diamonds and
You're like an
stuff like
outlier
that.
in your field, is what you're saying. They're like, oh, you don't look like
Yeah,
you've been out for like a month in the roughing it, right?
exactly. So yeah, I was that way, and for a while I toned it down because I felt weird. But it's just me, like how people need to get tattoos or
Mhm.
dress goth, whatever. I felt like I expressed myself best by like dressing up more, and I started doing that. And then when I started working with teachers, they had this impression of what a scientist looked like, like the lab coat and everything.
Mhm.
And my teacher was just like, like, you look so fancy. And she would just say that. And it just kind of stuck, and I liked it. And now I use it to kind of set myself apart, and also to bring attention to what scientists look like. So I,
Mhm.
I feature a different fancy scientist every Friday. And fancy is kind of a loose term. It definitely doesn't mean you're rich, but basically
Right.
like you have style or flair, and it can be it
I
can be
love
for
that.
any gender. And I feature different people as a way to show like these are what scientists look like. And
Mhm.
like I even get responses from my dad like, wow, that person's a scientist. You would have never
Mhm.
guessed that.
Yeah.
So and at first I thought I was only gonna be able to do it for like, I don't know, a couple of months, but I keep finding people. So it keeps going, and it's really fun. I like it.
Wow. I resonate with that completely because like when I was getting my doctorate, everybody that I saw looked nothing like me. And it was like the straight up like pocket protector, you know, like like the padded elbows and stuff. And it was just like a very stereotypical looking person who had their doctorate or was doing research in science. And it was just kind of like, here is the mold, click here, create
Yeah.
another, click here. And it probably influences my look. I'm like, yeah, I want to look different. I want to have blonde streak in my hair. I'm going to have
Yeah.
these black earrings and tattoos and stuff. And they're like, yeah, but I have this degree and I'm doing work, in this field. And you can look how you want to look, like how you feel. That's more true and authentic to you. That sounds like you felt like that. You're like, I don't look like any of these people going out here, like doing this stuff. And that's
Yeah, and
okay.
well, I think now it's becoming more okay,
Yeah.
but as a woman and scientist or woman in science, I frequently worried about people not taking me seriously.
Hmm.
And I do think that is still a struggle, especially like with the way that we dress. Like it's hard to know what to wear to an interview, and especially in
Yeah.
our field, like do you dress up because then people might think like, oh, you can't go to the field.
Yeah. How dare you?
but but yeah, I do. That is something that I think like I was more worried about in the past, but with social media, there's more and more people coming out saying like, I'm a
Yeah.
scientist. And I mean, so of course we had all the racial issues come to a
Yep.
head in the United States, and same thing in our science world. I'm pretty active on Twitter, and there's a lot of scientists on Twitter, and I mean, science has a huge diversity problem,
Yeah.
huge.
Most definitely.
And for diversity, I even say like you said, personality types,
Hmm.
like in order to be taken seriously, you have to like look a certain way,
Yeah.
and there's still that prejudice.
Or it's like somebody stereotypically is just like so serious all the time. And it's like, take my research very seriously, like, or like socially awkward. You couldn't
Yeah,
see that person is a typical academic person, and academia has had kind of all these controversies throughout the years of, being in academia, but not actually working in the field. And there's that too, is I fight that in my profession, where it's like, a lot of the people I studied under had actually never done the work that I do. They
yeah,
just are teaching about it and researching,
exactly.
but they're actually not practitioners of it. And I think that becomes confusing too on some level.
Yeah, and that's another reason why I went more into science communication, because I appreciate the research and I love doing research. I'm
Hmm.
still associated with research, but quite often I felt like I'm doing research and then there's a publication on, mammal communities or on forest
Hmm.
elephants, but on the ground, they're being killed, or
Hmm.
like I said with climate change, like people don't care about the data. So I've
Yeah.
just learned over the years that conservation is really a human issue. And if it's a science, I feel like it's much more of a social science, and
Mm.
understanding, like you said, how people think and how can
Yeah.
we change how they think to get the outcomes that we want. And I've become fascinated by that too. It's very interesting.
What do you think about, like, I'm sorry, I could ask you like 8 million questions. I don't even prepare anything. It just like
We could
floods in
do
my
we could do a
brain.
part two.
I know we might have to, because I just like all of a sudden in my mind, I was like, I have to ask her about this, of like why people place so much importance on their domestic animals, cats, dogs, and then maybe
Oh,
have
good.
less of a relationship with larger
That's a good
mammals or other
question.
things. Like, what's the divide in that?
I think it's because we learn individuals. You live with your cat, you live with your dog, you know your
Yeah.
personality. And there have been a couple of cases with wild animals, like Cecil the lion, that was a big one, or Harambe the gorilla, where the animal had a story about it. And
Hmm.
there could have been. I mean, I'm sure there's thousands of lions that die every year in, I forget what country that happened, in Zimbabwe, that are hunted, but Cecil was known, I think, because he was older and well studied, and well, also the whole issue of like he went outside the park and everything. But people can like really attach to individuals, and even more than wild and domestic. I struggle with this too. With our domestic animals, we prefer certain domestic animals over
Yeah.
other ones. So like if you think about your pets, like I feed my pets pet food, and that's essentially other domestic animals like cows and chickens.
Hmm.
And unless you're buying your food, and this ties into wellness as well, unless you're buying food from like sustainable farms that are more humane,
Yeah.
those animals are not treated well. So
Yeah.
So I think it's just about knowing individuals and about knowing the species as well. We if we grew up living with pigs, I don't and the
Hmm.
messages you're taught too. People who do grow up with pigs are taught usually that that's food. And
Yeah.
yeah, so it's culture and what we learn. But I do think people are a little too crazy with their pets nowadays. Like, I have pets and I love them, but like some people, it's like, man, oh my gosh, you put a lot of work into your pet.
I actually think it's crazier than ever because when I was growing up in
It
the 80s,
is.
like, people had dogs and stuff and cats, but it was like a very cavalier thing. It was like, oh yeah, I got a dog. And now like the amount of people who are like strolling their little dog in a stroller or traveling with their pet,
I
it's like
know.
explosive. And I'm like,
I know.
what happened to pets?
One of my blogger friends is making a dog cookbook,
Oh
and like
my.
like but like, and some of the recipes she was saying, like they sounded like I could eat them. And I was like, are there any recipes that like the humans can eat as well? And there were ones like where you could make and your pet could eat. So yeah, I do love my pets and I take really good care of them. And I've always, we've always had animals inside our house and
Yeah.
sleeping on our beds and stuff. But I do think people need to put it more in perspective, and I don't know, but it's also what brings you joy too.
So wildlife
So if
biologist
yeah.
going a little much with the pets here. Like we got dog cookbooks coming out. I mean, it's kind of nutty.
It's more that like I would rather see there's so much money spent in the pet industry. I would
Yeah.
rather see like money from people dressing up their dogs, like rather that money go to like a shelter or something. I
Yeah.
think that's
Yeah.
what bothers me more. You can cook
Okay.
for your pets, that's fine,
Sure.
but I do agree it's this or like why don't you let your dog walk? I agree. The stroller
Yeah.
thing is weird.
How many times I see that? Like I'm walking, I'm like, oh, I'm by the beach. I'm then like somebody comes strolling with their little dog in the stroller. I'm like, that dog can walk. Why can't it like just like no exercise for the dog? Like
Yeah. I know that's
it's like
weird.
maybe that desire to want to like nurture something. And people start treating their pets like their children, like they birthed them.
Mhm.
And I always think that's really strange, honestly.
Yeah, I definitely like I sometimes call myself like a fur mom jokingly, but not that often because now pets are taken so seriously. But yeah, or like I don't know, like I'll be around with friends and they'll show pictures of their pets, like they're the kids and stuff. It's like okay.
It's getting crazy out there. Well, Stephanie, thank you so much for your time. Literally, like I had like
Yeah, thank
another
you.
bunch of this. We might have to do this again because I
Yeah, we
keep
could totally do this again.
yeah, you keep saying stuff and I'm like, well, there's another question. Ask about that. So well, thank you for your time. And what a great thing. Everybody go check out Fancy Scientists and everything that Stephanie's up to because man, amazing information. Amazing. Thank you.